I'd like to invite Jennifer to talk to us today about driven to distraction or a move in the right direction. Please welcome Jennifer to the stage.
Thank you. So what I'm going to try to do is zoom through, that's interesting. It's not, this isn't increasing it here. Okay. Sorry, this is moving that and this differently. Maybe, but anyway, what I'm going to try to do is talk very briefly for those people who haven't really thought about how transport affects health and inequalities, a brief summary of that, and then talk about 3 research projects I've done. One about community severance, the barrier effect of busy roads. One about road travel fatality rates, sorry, it's England data, not New Zealand, and one about walking speed of older people. Now, transport, often when we talk about transport and health, a lot of people focus on the negative. So let's start being positive. Transport, sorry, there is a problem here.
Next slide, not your current slide.
No, on the next slide is showing my next slide, but on the main thing, it's showing the first slide only. And I don't know whether that means that people...
They're seeing the right thing.
They are seeing the right thing, so it's only me. Okay, it doesn't matter.
No, it's not only you, but we are seeing the right thing.
If you're seeing the right thing, not only on the screen, but on the Zoom screen, then don't worry about this. I have no idea why that's happened, but never mind. So I will use this rather than that. There are benefits from transport. That's the whole point of transport, is these benefits. Access to places, physical activity opportunities, and access to green and blue spaces, where there's increasing evidence of that blue spaces as well, which of course in Dunedin you have plenty of, as well as greenery in some places, are good for health. So access to goods, services and people, to employment, to education, to shops, to health and other services, social support networks and to recreation. So this may be transport as recreation or transport to recreation. And I'll come back to the social support networks later when I talk about community severance. But work from Julianne Holt-Lundstadt and others has shown, she published a meta-analysis in 2010, that the bigger your social network, and this can be small, casual acquaintances, people you might say hello to or wave to as you walk past them in the street, not close contacts. The bigger that social network, the better your health is. And the effect of this is of a similar magnitude to the benefits for cardiovascular mortality of stopping smoking. So this is huge. We're not talking about a tiny little effect. There's health benefits of walking and cycling. In England, and the figures are similar in New Zealand. Actually, I think they're worse in New Zealand. So in England, 38% of the adult population are insufficiently active, particularly women. But walking and cycling can provide the same health benefits as formal sports and exercise. It can increase cardiovascular and cardiorespiratory fitness. And walking or cycling to work can be as effective as a formal training program, as well as helping you meet the physical activity recommendations. And some people include public transport as active travel, because most people will walk or cycle at one or both ends of a journey. And Andy Dannenberg and colleagues in the States published a paper some years ago showing that people who walked to public transit, which in that case was mostly trains, were far more likely to meet the physical activity recommendations than people who went by car. And in many cases, they met it merely from that commute journey, even though the bulk of the journey was by train. But there are also harms from transport. Sedentary behaviour as perhaps a corollary or the inverse from being physically active. Air pollution, carbon emissions, noise, tarmac, community severance and injuries. So I'm going to flick through some of these and then spend a bit more time on the ones where I've done the benefits. So why is it important that so many people aren't physically active enough? This is from the Health Survey for England, which is my main paid job. It's a national health examination survey. It runs each year with a new nationally representative sample in England. It started in 1991, so we've currently got the 29th survey in the field. The solid lines are generalised obesity based on BMI. This is measured height and weight. Funnily enough, in England, as with everywhere else that's looked, people tend to overestimate their height and underestimate their weight, which makes actually quite a big difference when you categorise BMI. More worrying is the abdominal obesity, which is much worse in women than men. And this is based on waist circumference. And this is particularly problematic because diabetes, cardiovascular disease, most of the health consequences of obesity are far more related to abdominal fat than they are to overall obesity, partly because of this fat distribution and partly because, for example, rugby players will have a high BMI, but until they stop playing rugby and they lose their muscle mass and say, but I've always been this way. Yeah, but you're now obese. It's muscle, so BMI is not such a good indicator. I've no idea what's going on. So in England, and this is out of date, it's probably worse than this now, obesity causes about 9,000 premature deaths every year, each of whom loses about 9 years of life. And obesity costs more than £5 billion per year in England. That's health and social care costs as well as lost productivity and other costs to society. There are major impacts of air pollution. It causes and or exacerbates asthma and other respiratory disease, chronic obstructive pulmonary disease in particular, heart attack, stroke, lung cancer. In fact, the big study that Dolan Hill did back in the 1950s, the case control study that was first to show that smoking caused lung cancer or was associated with lung cancer, it was case control, so it couldn't show cause. When they started it, they actually thought it was air pollution. And smoking was added as an afterthought just before they started their field work. We now know that obesity and dementia are also caused by air pollution. And the WHO estimates 7 million deaths a year. Now, half of those are from indoor air pollution, particularly cooking fuels. And obviously not all of the outdoor air pollution is from transport. There's a smaller proportion in New Zealand there is in the UK, but it still is a substantial contributor. There's also carbon emissions. In the UK, road transport is the only sector where carbon emissions are increasing, both as a proportion of all emissions and in absolute terms as well. It's a much smaller proportion of your emissions, which doesn't mean you can be complacent about transport. It just means you've got other things to deal with, like burning wood in homes for heating and fuel is one of the major ones I can find. So the way people travel grossly affects how much transport contributes, and I am aware that I have flown here, but no. Anyway. Noise pollution is bad for health as well. It raises your blood pressure, which then puts you at risk of heart disease and stroke. It interferes with concentration and sleep, and it disrupts education. And this is particularly important in the longer term and regarding inequalities, because people's educational attainment is one of the most important predictors of future health as an adult and longevity. Has all sorts of other impacts on health, with thanks to Claire Pascoe from NZTA for this slide. She pointed out that it's only when it comes to cars that people don't think it's weird that you store your personal possessions in a public place. So in Los Angeles, a third of the land area is roads, and a third of the land area is used for car parks. It causes planning blight. The tarmac replaces greenery. Now, greenery is good for your mental health and well-being. It also encourages people to walk and cycle in areas where there is greenery. So the more tarmac is, the worse for your mental health and the less likely you are to be active. And it also increases the heat island effect, whereby city centres are often several degrees warmer than surrounding areas, which is particularly a problem in heatwave times and increased mortality there. And also there's runoff from the tarmac. Water doesn't get absorbed, so there's runoff and it's often contaminated by the heavy metals in the exhaust. Transport and health. Transport is also a major contributor to inequalities in health. There are fewer benefits and more harms. So in general, poorer people and people living in more deprived areas make fewer trips, and if we assume that trips are made for beneficial purposes, that's not good. The young and the old are disproportionately in poorer groups. They're less likely to have car access, which is good where there are other options available, but that's no good in a society that is designed assuming everybody uses the car. So particularly in New Zealand, this is a major problem. Women generally have less access to cars than men. Girls have generally less independent mobility than boys. There are also socioeconomic and ethnic differences within countries and between countries. So for example, if you think about global climate change, it tends to be the richer countries that are pouring out more greenhouse gases and the poorer countries that are going to suffer the worst consequences and be most placed for dealing with climate events.
Someone has it muted, so if you just tell everyone.
If everybody who is listening in, please mute your microphone. Thank you. And so sea level rising, low-lying areas flooding, or horrendous weather events, more likely in poorer countries which are less able to cope with them in terms of services and healthcare and whatever. But there's also various things like air pollution where there's greater susceptibility and greater exposure. So if you can live somewhere which is not polluted, that's where you do. So it tends to be people who are in it. Please, could everybody mute their microphone if you're dialing in or listening online? Thank you. But they're also more likely to be susceptible because it's particularly people with pre-existing cardiorespiratory disease and the very young and the very old who are most susceptible to air pollution. The good news is that if you can reduce air pollution, you can contribute to reducing health inequalities. So if I now move on to the first of the three areas I was going to talk about, I think I'm going to have to cut this somewhat short, looking at the time though. So to thank my colleagues, because obviously the work I'm presenting has been mostly done by other people. So community severance, the barrier effect of busy roads or of transport infrastructure, motorways, rivers, railways, that sort of thing. So what is community severance? Well, it's a barrier effect from transport infrastructure or the volume or speed of traffic, which impedes people's access to the goods, services, and people that they need or want to get to. I've mentioned the importance of social networks already, but there's also the use of streets as social places, children playing in streets, children being given the freedom that they can walk and cycle around locally, which is good for their mental and physical development and their self-esteem. And what we're looking for is what a friend of mine calls free-range children. I don't know if this is familiar to you, I hope it is. In the early 1970s, Donald Appleyard and Mark Lintel in San Francisco studied the residents of 3 streets. When they'd moved in 20 years previously, the people were all very similar, but over the intervening 2 decades, the amount of traffic had increased. And they asked people to mark down where their friends lived and where they had acquaintances in the street. The street with light traffic, which was 140 vehicles a day, had nearly 5.5 friends per person and over 6 acquaintances on average. Medium, somewhat in between, heavy traffic, which was 21,000 vehicles a day, had just over 1 friend and just under 3 acquaintances per day. And there isn't time to go into it, but they did all sorts of other things which I can talk about later if there were to be some spare time. And as part of my PhD, I had done a systematic review of community severance and health, and I found loads of peer-reviewed papers and grey literature reports stating community severance is bad for health. And I found not a single study that had looked at it. And one reason is because it's very difficult to study something you can't measure. Yes, not everything you can measure is important, and not everything that's important can be measured, but it's difficult to study it. So we got funding, I will thank the funders later, to develop a toolkit. And I'll go very, very briefly through each of these. Participatory mapping, going along to older people's luncheon clubs and coffee mornings, stopping people in the street and bartering a cup of coffee for 5 minutes of their time, giving people maps of their areas. We did this in 4 case studies, 2 in London and 2 outside. Where do you go? How do you get there? Where don't you go or don't like going? Why not? Getting people to map it out. We developed a pen and paper questionnaire. We did it as pen and paper to make it easier for local communities to be able to use it if they wanted to. And we asked socio-demographic, economic questions, the short Warwick-Edinburgh mental wellbeing questionnaire, but we also, the key bits were various questions on a Likert scale from never to all the time, asking people about their neighbourhood, by which we meant within a mile or 20-minute walk, asking them about to what extent they're bothered by volume of traffic, speed of traffic, lighting, quality of the pavement, air pollution, noise pollution, that sort of thing. And we also asked them about the busiest road near them, and to name it, and we also asked them about their own road, and we also asked for any of these things that are in your area, how they got there by different modes, and whether if they didn't walk there, whether one could walk to a whole range of destinations. Video surveys aren't new, but what we were doing was new, because Paolo compared the actual pedestrian flows with what was expected from the walkability model. And he also calculated the crossing ratio, what proportion of people walking along actually crossed the road, how long they had to wait. This was hours and hours of research at time. A formal crossing, this is an informal crossing. You get off the bus, you want to be over there, so you just cross the road. So he was noting where people were crossing as well. The spatial analysis and walkability model. Walkability reflects the potential for walking. If there's time at the end, I can tell you what's in the model. In fact, Transport for London gave him their pedestrian data from their survey, and actually the correlation was 0.9 something ludicrously high. What Ashley, who developed this, noted was that community severance seemed to be occurring where walkability was high in the same place as high motor transport traffic levels. And we actually used that to identify our 4th case study by doing it backwards and then going to the local authority and saying, what do you think of these places? And they said those are the 6 worst places. I haven't time to go into the stated preference survey, except to say that 100 people in each of the case study areas, and then another 2,500 online where there may not have been community severance, were given scenarios, different amounts of traffic, different volumes, different crossing circumstances, and were asked, depending either the cheaper newspaper across the road than here, which option would you take, or a different type of crossing, how far up they would be prepared to walk to do that. So the stated preference survey isn't actually in the toolkit, but it was used to develop a valuation tool, which will be available any month now, but the provisional estimate is that the value of social costs, well-being, losses to local businesses, and a few other things I didn't note down, comes to 2.8% of GDP, or £1,100 per person per year in Great Britain. And a severance index, which gives how difficult it is, or the disutility of crossing, going from 0, where the cars may be inconvenienced, people aren't, to 100 where there's no way you would cross it. I won't say any, oh, I've misspaced syntax. Interesting. Right. Street audit. Yes, not a new tool. We used one that had been developed previously by TRL for Transport for London, assessing every link and every junction, extremely time consuming, even if you do internal training, very subjective. And in the end, we try to be transdisciplinary with my postdoc, the space syntax postdoc, and the transport postdoc. And in the end, the transport one told the others to go away. He was going to do it all himself because he felt it was going to be more uniform that way, but it took him hours. And there are other tools from communities. And space syntax, all I'm going to say is it's a measure of how connected places are. If you want to look up what it is, you can Wikipedia it just as easy, or Google it just as easy as I can. Our case study in Finchley Road, I was at school there. Dark blue, difficult to get to anywhere from there, very not connected. Red and orange, the most connected places. The most hated place in this study was trying to cross the road there, which is a nightmare. So the toolkit. It was designed to assist local authorities, consultants and local communities to better understand community severance and what to do about it, to provide advice on how to measure it and to assess the impact on local communities. And some, as I mentioned, some of the tools were aimed at local communities, some at local government, some at researchers. So it contains, the introduction was an overview of the toolkit, but what we knew was a summary of what was known before we started and some of the key findings we had at that stage, although we've published more things since then. Each of these new tools had a case study, well, not the valuation tool because we hadn't actually done it by then, and a brief description of how to do it. For the Health and Neighbourhood Mobility Survey, we've provided online the actual survey as a PDF for people who just want to do it off the shelf, as a Word document for people who want to pick and mix some and either discard some questions or add others of their own. There's also two how-to guides. One, hopefully written in simple English, no jargon, lay audience. One is how to do a survey and why you might want a random sample and that sort of thing. And the other is how to analyse the data, assuming that in at least some cases, if a local community did this survey, there might not be anybody there who felt competent to analyse the data. There's an Excel sheet and a how-to document that show that they'd be able to do some automated analyses just of some frequencies and some simple crosstabs. And we thought then they might actually go to the local government and say, we thought there was a problem, we've done this survey, there is a problem, here's our data. The other useful tools are things that we haven't invented, but are guiding people to where they can find various different street surveys or whatever. In the introduction, we also summarise the tools, why you might want to use each one and what resources you might need, because like space syntax, the software is freely available, but you need a heck of a lot of expertise to do it. Surveys, depending on who's actually doing it, can take a lot of resources. You either need people or you need the money to pay people to go out and recruit and collect it and input the data and so on. So different tools need different things, and it depends on what resources you've got and what questions you're trying to answer, which tool or tools you use. It is pick and mix. Some architecture students in Havana used the video survey tool, were terribly apologetic that they didn't actually have a video. They had the two of them standing there with pen and paper, hour after hour after hour, noting this. Did we mind? We were thrilled that they'd found it useful. It's a toolkit. Help yourself if it's useful. So to thank our three funders, the Medical Research Council, which as a doctor is the one I would have expected to fund me, said, when you've proven that it actually does affect health, then you can ask us for some money. So thanks to the other research councils. It's freely available. UCL has stopped having what they call vanity URLs. So this is now redirected to my institute, but it should all be there. And if you can't find things, email it. It's all freely available. All but one of the publications are freely available. One place wouldn't allow it. So they're all open access. You can use it if you want, but if you do, we'd really like to know if you've used it, we'd like feedback and what happened as a result, and any changes you'd recommend. So, variations by age, sex, and travel modes. I'm not actually covering deprivation because I haven't got time. So, I've mentioned that active travel is good for you. It gives you physical activity. It's relatively age independent, certainly compared with driving. It's affordable. If you can buy bikes quite cheaply, or people nick them frequently. It gives you door-to-door access. I'm not advocating it. I'm merely stating from my experience. It doesn't impede on anybody else's air quality, and the level of air pollution you're exposed to is less than if you're inside a vehicle. It's flexible. You go when you want. You're not dependent on a timetable. It's good for your mental health as well as your physical health. If increasing active travel in England and Wales has been estimated to save the NHS about £17 billion in healthcare costs, and increasing active travel in New Zealand, I think that's to the level of the city that's got the greatest current active travel levels, would prevent 1,300 deaths a year, or so we were told at the TAILS Symposium last month. And there are broader environmental benefits, of course, of reducing carbon emissions, air and noise pollution, and easing congestion on roads and public transport, and it's often quicker, certainly within cities. But cycling is perceived as unsafe in many places. Now, road deaths in England fell dramatically in the decade from 2006, but we still have large numbers of injuries and fatalities, and there are actually 5 deaths and 68 serious injuries every day in Great Britain, though you wouldn't know that if you read the paper, because it's the rare that hits the news. She was a Times journalist, front page of the Times. If you're a cyclist and you're injured, you hit the news. If you're having a heart attack or a stroke and you're a couch potato, the doctors in ER don't say this person's here because they didn't walk and cycle for travel. And if you're in your 80s and you've now reduced your cycling to about 40 miles a day instead of 80 miles a day, and you're not being seen by healthcare, again, you have a low visibility. Now, we've shown in a paper I published some years ago that there were marked differences in fatality rates by age, gender and mode. And in fact, the differences by age and gender were greater than the differences by mode. But given the fall in mortality, we want to see if these had persisted. So again, work done by other people under my supervision. So, the exposure is from the National Travel Survey. We use both time spent travelling by age and sex and mode and distance travelled. And the number of deaths is our national mortality data, except for drivers where we used police data. Just for England, for these 6 years, we included any road travel injury, which I think, same in New Zealand, is defined as involving a vehicle. But we also included pedestrian falls in the street, because if you fall off your bike, you're included. If you drive your car into a fence, you're included. If you fall over because the pavement's uneven, or you're drunk, or you're unsteady on your feet, that's not included. And we thought, well, it's not really a like-for-like comparison. So here are fatality rates per million hours spent travelling. The y-axis goes up to 3 here. Age along here and all ages. We haven't got below 17 to drive, but this, that's interesting. Something's happened to my labels. Sorry, this is cycling, this is this one here, this one there. This is walking and this is driving. Below 17, it's illegal to drive, so of course nobody actually provides that information to the National Travel Survey. So there are deaths of drivers under the age of 17, but we've got no denominator data. And the next ones I'll show you, the all ages are actually 17 plus. So for cycling and walking, it's J-shaped. It increases dramatically at the age of 7. A chart that I'll show you in a moment, only going up to 69, we only go up to 1 on the y-axis. But it's U-shaped for driving. And this is comparing males and females. In general, the fatality rates are higher for males than females, whichever denominator we use. More cyclist death than pedestrians, but there are confidence intervals, particularly for women, because there are relatively few women cyclists. And males aged 17 to 20 are safer if they cycle than if they drive. Some other work that I haven't got time to show you is published in the same issue of the Journal of Transport and Health, which is March last year, by Sean Scholes et al., looking at deaths of other road users by age and sex of driver or cyclist, also showed that the rest of us are safer if young males cycle rather than driving. Now, if you look at, so that was up to the age of 69, goes up to 1, and that's what happens if you have the age groups from 70 plus. This is per billion kilometres. You can argue whether distance or time is the right denominator. This time, pedestrians, including falls, remember, is higher for males than cycle deaths are. I haven't shown you the 70 plus. My husband said you've got far too many charts, but it's almost the same as the previous one, the actual numbers. The only thing is that to get the confidence intervals on, it goes up to 800. Now, we're not unique in finding this. This is American data, and this is per 100 million trips. So a third different denominator. Drivers and passengers, interestingly, with the same U shape, and then pedestrians, and that's not including falls. This is just hit by a vehicle, is J-shaped, as we found. So what's the actual risk of death for males? Well, for males, there were 26.5 deaths per billion kilometres, which is 1 for every 38 million kilometres cycled. And if you assume that the average cyclist cycles 1,500 kilometres a year, and I'm not sure if that's a good figure or not, but that's the one I was given. And I think maybe for people who are commuting rather than going out on their long leisure lives, it may be. That means that they'd have to cycle for 25,000 years on average to have 1 statistical death. For females, the risk is even lower. That's the paper. So why is the perception so different from the reality? Now, some work done by Alex Macmillan in the Preventive and Social Medicine Department here when she was in London casts some light on this. I blame the media. So cycling trips in London doubled from 1992 to 2012. But the proportion of cycling fatalities covered in the local media increased in that time from 6% of deaths to 75% of deaths. So you would have the perception that cycling deaths were becoming more and more common, but actually it was the reporting of them. And over the same period, hardly any motorcyclist deaths, which are far, far higher in terms of whatever denominator you use. If you're looking at rates or numbers, they're far higher, but coverage remained low. So it's disproportionate both to the absolute risk and relative to other road travel risk. And finally, I hope I've still got time for my third area of research. This is where I've brought the two halves of my job, the health survey and transport and health, together. So there were news reports in London of changes to traffic light timings to increase motor vehicle flow. Now, the invitation to cross is when the green person is shining constantly and you're being invited to start crossing the road. And that, in England certainly, or in Great Britain, depends on the width of the road. It's 10, 8 or 6 seconds, and they were proposing in London to reduce it from 10 to 6 seconds because of not wanting to impede drivers, who of course are far more important than pedestrians. So we all got up in arms about that because we didn't realise the difference between invitation to cross and clearance time. Crossing times, but this means the clearance time, the amount from when the invitation to cross ends, and we have a green flashing person, and you scarily have a red flashing person, meaning you're fine to carry on crossing the road while I carry on flashing. The cars aren't going to start, but please don't start crossing. And that uses, in every country we've been able to find out, I still haven't been able to find out from New Zealand, it's 1.2 metres per second, which is 4.3 kilometres per hour. Now, the studies that have been done have all shown that this is far too fast for older people. But most studies, in fact, I think all studies up until ours, some since then have done what we've done, were measuring the speed of people who looked older as they were crossing the road, which also means that they're excluding people who've excluded themselves from trying to get across the road. But even so, they found that this speed was much faster than the speed that they were actually walking at. And we saw this on our travels. I think it was meaning 35 kilometre an hour advised for speed limit because of pedestrians, but sometimes it does make it seem that, you know, unless you can run across the road at 35 kph, don't even try. I was also rather startled to find this document that says pedestrians cross the road an average of 2 to 3 times on every walking trip. And I thought, that must be wrong. That cannot be right. I mean, you know, just walking 3 blocks down George Street, you've crossed the road. And when I showed this to another group, somebody from the public said, no, that's right. The average walking trip in New Zealand is incredibly short. So that's also something to be rather worried about. Anyway, back to my topic. The Health Survey for England, I've already told you a little bit about it. The 29th one is currently in the field. So this analysis was of 3,000 adults, a random population sample of people visited in their own homes in 2005. These were 3,000 adults who had had an interview and had a visit by a nurse and had had a timed 8-foot walk. So just to remind you, there's supposed to be a green line across at 1.2. You can come and look at it, it's here. Very strange. Anyway, 1.2 is the assumed speed. This gives you the mean and standard deviation walking speed by age group and gender. And you can see none of the groups, not even the males aged 65 to 69 are up at that speed. And this shows the proportion of individuals in each age and sex group whose normal walking speed is less than 1.2. Again, people were, some people from transport organisations criticised this and saying, well, that's their normal walking speed, not their maximum walking speed. Would you want people walking at their maximum walking speed when they're getting across the road? Oh, we also had the RAC, bless their little cotton socks, saying, but you don't see large numbers of elderly people who've been hit lying around on the ground near crossings. Well, duh, you know, it's the deterrent of it. Anyway, so of those people aged 65 plus who were able to walk 8 foot unaided, 76% of men and 85% of women had a normal walking speed of below this 1.2 metres per second. We published the paper. We had massive media coverage, nationally, internationally, locally, radio, television, print media, online. It was incredible. 18 months later, Living Streets, you also have a similar organisation here, used our data to start a new campaign. And from Wellington. So men have an average, men aged 65 and over in our study had an average walking speed of 3.2 kilometres per hour and women of 2.9. And they were campaigning to reduce the assumed walking speed to 0.8 metres per second. More than 10,000 people wrote to their MP asking for 3 more seconds. And the Department for Transport said they would consult on the signs and guidance, and the Transport Minister said he would have an urgent review of crossing timings. And the RAC, bless them, produced this report. Every second counts. You know, every second you give to pedestrians is taking a second, delaying a driver by a second, and drivers are so much more valuable. But the Transport Research Laboratory, who were commissioned by Living Streets to do a review of the data, found that our survey was backed up by everything else. Not surprising, because ours was by far the biggest, so we did rather dominate those. But there have been other studies, the English longitudinal study of ageing and a study in Brazil published in the journal that have found exactly the same things. So what happened as a result of our campaign? No change in the walking speeds and the clearance time. But partial success. In 2015, the Department for Transport, that's our equivalent, your ministry, published guidance that no new pelican crossings, which are the type I've been describing, can be installed. And new crossings either have to be the countdown, so you can see clearly how much longer you've got, and you can judge for yourself if you think you can get across, or it has to be a puffin, which stands for pedestrian user-friendly intelligent, which is the sort which has got the symbols here and nothing on the far side, which is really scary for people who don't understand how it works. And it's controlled by a camera, so all the time you are crossing, it's red for the traffic and you can go. Obviously, once again, work done by all sorts of other people. And this is the first and probably only time that my research has been made into a wrap by a group of elders in Kilburn. If we have time at the end, I can do it, and if not, you can look at it online yourselves. It's called Hey Mr. Boris, referring to the man who was then our Mayor of London, then became a foreign minister, and God forbid he's hoping to become our Prime Minister. Please can I stay in New Zealand? So, moving to my final few slides about policy. If you want to reduce fatal and non-fatal injuries, what you need to do is reduce road danger. Road safety tends to come with targets. You can have no child pedestrian injuries if you have no child pedestrians. What you need to do is reduce road danger. I'll talk to you privately about the cycle lanes I've been using the last 2 days. Reducing car use, more active travel, more physical activity, huge health benefits. Reduced emission of pollutants if people can be got out of their cars, fewer serious injuries, and reductions in inequalities. Enrique Peñalosa, who was the mayor of Bogota and started the 8 to 80 city movement, said a developed city is not one where the poor drive cars, it's one where the rich use the buses. A transport planning hierarchy that puts pedestrians at the top and single-use private cars at the bottom. And we need the funding to match that. The funding tends to be the other way round. And the recognition, which transport planners in the UK are beginning to get, and less so, I think, in New Zealand, and certainly not the public here. But transport's not about moving cars, it's about helping people get from where they are to where they want or need to be. And these pictures show the amount of space taken up by 69 people on a bus, on bikes, walking, and that's actually 40 cars, not 69 cars. So I'll leave you with a quote from our former Chief Medical Officer in England. The potential benefits of physical activity to health are huge. If a medication existed which had a similar effect, it would be regarded as a wonder drug or miracle cure.
The heat map that you showed quite earlier on in the first section, it was
the walkability.
Yeah,
well, yes.
Heat map. I couldn't interpret it.
Sorry. What it was is the peaks. The higher it was and the more red it was, is the greater the walkability. This is about the potential. We'll get there eventually. The potential for making journeys on foot. So it included that one. No, next one. Right. It's the 4 things that went into it: a residential density, so the number of people available to make a trip, public transport access, connectedness, for which what was novel here is they used space syntax rather than junction density, and that range of land use as potential destinations. And again, what was novel is instead of using a two-dimensional land use, he used a three-dimensional volume of things. So London is a series of little villages that are all connected up really through sprawl. So all these little peaks are the local high street in the local area. And then I'm not quite sure what that one is down there, but mostly in the centre. That's Oxford Street and places around like that. So the higher it is and the redder it is, the more walkable. The bluer and flatter, the fewer places you could get to, the fewer of your journeys you would make on foot. And he's now done this for the whole of the UK, but it takes weeks of computer time. And he'd be very happy if you pay the Space Syntax Lab, they'd be delighted to do it for any or all of New Zealand.
Mm-hmm. Any questions?
Jenny, I do have a question with regards to our cycle lanes, and if you don't want to do this publicly,
I know it's going to drive those to be critical.
So were you aware of how they looked like before they built them? And so
I know that I gather they're a huge improvement.
So that's what I was going to ask
yes.
you. Do you think
I was nearly doored this morning, coming in this way from Glenleith State Highway, on the bits where there's a narrow barrier, and there was a coach, and it had a door that didn't open like that, but opened like that, and it was just closing, and I thought, I hope he isn't going to open it again. So I moved over to the left hand of the lane, and as I nearly got level, so the door opened, I shouted at him. But, you don't expect to be doored when you're cycling in a segregated cycle lane. And then if the lane switches from one side of the road to the other, and you've sort of gone through the lights before you realise there was a sign saying cyclists cross over. And then if you're on the left-hand side and you want to turn right, like to get to Union Street West, you've got to get off and cross at the lights because there's no way you can get across the traffic to be there. And if you're on the right-hand side and you want to turn left, you've got to left. If you're cycling, you don't want to walk. That's why you've got the bicycle. It looks as if no cyclists were involved in designing these. And I was talking to Rebecca.
Is it more the disconnection rather than the actual safety once you're on?
Apart from being doored, I feel safe when I'm there. But I do cycle around London, so I have a fairly high tolerance level. But there's also inconsistencies. So when you're going, I don't know which cardinal direction, towards the university from Glenleith, you get to actually in either direction, you get to the junction with Dundas, and there's a cycle red or green as well as an arrow. And there, the cycle is red while the traffic turns, and you have to wait. And the first time I didn't notice, that's how I just went through. Luckily, there was nobody turning. Then I noticed, just as I've gone through, that there was a red cycle. So since then, I've been waiting. And you wait for them to go. Then there are other junctions where there's nothing, and other junctions where there is a red arrow for turning right or left, and the cyclists go through, and the turning cars go in. There's no consistency, so you have no idea. You've really got to look each time. And if you're actually moving along, you've hardly got time to process it. So I don't know who designed them, or whether, but...
Didn't they tell you they had to go through a 4-day course to use it?
Well, I must say, I stopped at one light, stayed, and a cyclist came up, and most people was passing me, came up, and I said, how do I turn right from here? And he said, no idea. Good luck. Yeah, I did a blog about it. And I'm also, after discussing it with somebody who perhaps should remain nameless, I'm also going to write, as a professor at the university, which I am this week, to the City Council. I was told that every little helps.
We lost some car parks, that helps.
Well, yeah, last Friday I was reading in the paper that the bus stops that are now redundant because of the bus hub and changing routes, that with the exception of 5, the bus stops are going to be made into extra car parking. Although somebody else said, oh, that's an interim measure. And what? Interim, but they're keeping 5 that aren't. But
Maybe one more quick question, if anybody has it, because I know some other people have a meeting starting at 2:30.
There seems to be a problem in New Zealand with trialling different types of pedestrian crossings. This cropped up in the nunnery work they were doing, where they designed this crossing that would be much brighter and more visible because this was a major issue. And it went into the black box of transport decision making and it never came out again. There were people who were supposed to sign it off who just didn't. And there are public servants who just want to go and do it the way they always have, who say it's not consistent with our existing guidelines. So therefore you're not allowed to trial anything.
Well, I mean, that's crazy, isn't it? I mean, I think amongst the various things that have struck me as unexpected, shall I face it that way, the fact that 80% of all trips in New Zealand are by car and fewer than 10% by foot and fewer than 10% by public transport. Okay, I'm lucky I live in London. The distances are huge. And we've got twice the population of the whole of New Zealand. So it's a very different circumstance. But I've used the buses in Wellington. You want a bus? You wait a few minutes, one comes along, you get on it. Here, if you're lucky, there'll be a bus that does what you want. If you're lucky, it'll be every 15 minutes, not every 30 minutes during the day, and every 30 minutes, not every 60 minutes at night. If I want to go to the Salsa here, which is just down the road, it starts at 9 o'clock. My last bus back to Maryhill was at 10:05. And the buses are empty. And people say, oh, well, we can't put on more buses because nobody uses them. No, nobody uses them because they're so infrequent. If you actually had buses running every 5 minutes, people might use them. So, you know, somebody's actually got to put them out. You need to internalise all the externalities from car use that money to provide other options for people, whether it's the infrastructure or the buses or whatever, and then start penalising them for using cars. But it's really, really difficult. But New Zealand's got the third highest obesity in the world. So, you know, it's also got amongst the highest car ownership and car use in the world. Now, that's not to say that one is causal related to the other, but they are two key facts here. But yeah, I mean, the Belisha Beacon, when I was looking up how to spell Belisha Beacon, because I know it's named after Mr. Belisha, who invented them, I was astonished to find that those funny little orange cardboard things that you have, which are hardly visible at all, are called Belisha Beacon discs. And I think Mr. Belisha would be turning in his grave, because the whole point about his beacon is it flashes at you. And you can see the newer ones in England have actually got a sort of a halo of LEDs instead of being a light bulb in the middle of the thing. Tails, somebody was saying that local transport planners are arguing against what we call zebra crossings, uncivilised pedestrian crossings, because drivers don't stop at them. And I'm saying, well, in that case, the problem is the drivers, not the crossings. But maybe if you had the flashing lights, not these silly orange cardboard things. But hopefully policy will change.
Okay, if you can join in thanking Jenny for joining us. Thank you so much.